If I had one retirement portfolio to recommend or choose, it would be this one right here. But I'm going to caution you before you get too hyped on this, because it's something that always has to be looked at in the big text, the big picture. All right, so last time I was doing my live stream, it was actually, I like how I'm doing it now. I'm doing it on my phone where I have access to the whiteboard. I can draw stuff because for me, I'm a visual learner, and and I'm also a visual educator as well, where I can actually draw stuff with my chicken scratch on my whiteboard. Man, it just helps for me to, I think, explain my concepts, at least to me. Maybe not to you, but to me. Come on, buddy. And so last night we're kind of going over the barbell and whatnot, but I share with you an idea which I like a lot, which is 10% in cash, 15% in Ginnie Mae, and 75% in Wellington. All right, so 10 cash, 15 Ginnie Mae, 75% in Wellington. So essentially that's 25% cash in guaranteed government bonds, about 25% then in corporate bonds, because Wellington, 35% of Wellington is in corporate bonds roughly. And then that's about 50% total in the large cap value stocks. I just think that's a great portfolio. Some will say it's no international stocks. I don't care. Some will say, I don't know what to say. There's no small cap stocks. I don't care. When you're retiring, you're not trying for as much growth as you are when you're accumulating. So I would not do this for an accumulating portfolio, because there is no growth. I mean, and when I mean growth, there's no small caps. I don't have any international, but I think it is valid to have small caps, and I think it's valid to have growth stocks as well, for sure, just for a diversification perspective. But be that as it may, when you're retired, it's not growth so much as it is distribution, giving you income that you can't outlive while also maintaining growth to beat, hopefully, the rate of inflation if it ever comes back. And that's the caution. First, you can't backtest Ginnie Mae beyond 1980. It doesn't go back that long. So there's no way to backtest this portfolio other than through the freaking, the grand slam home run that was bonds from the 80s into the 90s into the aughts. I mean, from 1982 to 2011, the bond market did incredibly well. And the reason was because we had this huge destroying of interest rates. And I've said this a million times a Sunday, but you bought a 30-year treasury in 1982. It was paying you 15 and a quarter interest. Now, you could have bought a shorter term bond and pay you more. The problem with that is that shorter term bond matured earlier, and thus you had to trade in that shorter term bond that was paying 20% for a whole lot less interest in a few years. Whereas if you bought the 30-year, you're getting 15 and a quarter each and every year, guaranteed by the federal government until 2011. I don't think it takes a rocket science to realize that come the late 90s, early aughts, that bond was incredibly valuable. People would freaking kill for that bond. Probably even up till 2008. They would have paid well above par value, well above. To get 15 and a quarter guaranteed by the federal government, people would kill for that bond. Well, when that bond matured in 2011, if you had $100,000, you're getting $15,250 a year in income for those 30 years. All right. At maturity, you had to trade that bond in because it was matured, and instead you got 3%. So when you were getting 15,300 in, maybe it's 4% at that point. I don't think so. I think it's 3%. I think it's 3 and a quarter actually went down to. So now you're getting 3,250. All right. So your income went from 15,000 in 1982 each and every year until 3,000 30 years later. And of course, 3,000 bought a whole heck of a lot less than 3,000 would have done in 1982. All right. So you can see that was a golden era of bonds. Now, Ginnie Mae was part of that. And I've done research on Ginnie Mae. Basically, it averaged roughly about 6.5% to 7% a year since inception. And you're sitting there thinking, whoa, and it's only had minor down years. I think it's had 2 or 3 down years, just nothing, just small potato stuff. And people are like, whoa, and I was, until I recognized how this works. Whoa, Ginnie Mae, if we back test going back to 1980, that's a 40-year back test, and look at that track record, holy smokes. But it doesn't go back to 1970, 1966, when inflation was rearing its ugly head in these states and probably the world as a whole. And so we have no history of Ginnie Mae in an inflationary economy, none whatsoever. And we have history now of Ginnie Mae in a low interest rate environment over the last basically 15 years. And it's done okay, not great, but okay. And what I mean by that, it stayed above zero net of inflation. Nothing to write home about. But again, the point is you can't use the golden era of Ginnie Mae for 30 years, or of any bonds for 30 years, to include the bonds in the Wellington to forward that in your retirement projections. You can't do that. It doesn't make sense to do that, because that was the golden age of bonds. And that's the problem that we have, is that how do you then say, well, what else do I do? Because if we only go back 40 years for back testing, how do I know how we'll do, or give me some idea how we'll do going forward? And the answer is, I don't know. I'll share what I do, but that's the issue that we have. To go back and model a portfolio, how I would have done it, it'd almost be the same thing as saying, I'm going to use 1982 as my starting point and model from 1982 to 1999 and model that for my stocks. You're like, whoa, you return something like 17% a year from 1982 to 1999. See what I'm saying? That'd be like the same thing there. So to model bonds based on 1980 starting point and extrapolate any kind of data for that to go forward would be no different than the model stocks from 1982 to 1999 and say, hey, we can extrapolate that as some kind of guesstimate of what you're going to get in the future. You just can't do that. But at least with stocks, we have a history going back to 1870 to give us some idea. Inflationary times, deflationary times, low inflationary times, higher inflationary times, wars, depressions, recessions, everything in between. Because the S&P 500 has tracking numbers that go back that far. The bond market, on the other hand, is the Ginnie Mae doesn't have that. So when I say, 10% cash, 15% Ginnie Mae, and the rest in Wellington, at least in Wellington, we have a track record going back to 1930. But again, as I just said in another video, the problem with the Wellington fund going back to 1930 is that the interest rates are higher than they are today as well. So that's a challenge that we have there. But you got to be careful on looking at any bond fund, essentially for the last 30, well, not last 30 years anymore, but from the golden era of the 1980s. If the bond, like I'll even give you another example, the USA Income Fund, USAIX, that was founded in 1974. And when I was at USA, starting like 2008, 2009, starting at 2008, that fund had an average annual return of like 8.25%. And people are like, whoa, I want that fund. And that's when I learned how bonds work. I said, but you're not getting that. Well, it's shown that in the historical past. It's irrelevant going forward. It really is. People have a hard time grasping that. They have a hard time grasping that the bond market of the past has nothing to do with the bond market of the future. And so because that, if you're modeling any kind of bond fund that doesn't have a track record of going back beyond 1980s, it's just not worth it. And that's the problem with looking at cash, Ginnie Mae, and Wellington, is that what is your anticipation of those three funds in terms of going forward? And if you're like, well, the best we can do is model what is done historically, that's just not going to get the job done. Hope this helps. Thanks.